Today I'm going full lunch lady as I make Sloppy Joes. And not just any Sloppy Joes, because in a nostalgic effort to relive a moment of my blissful youth, I am making the quintessential middle school Sloppy Joes using the recipe provided to US school cafeterias in the 1980s and 90s. So thank you to Thrive Market for sponsoring this video because, to quote Cartman,
"It's Sloppy Joe Day! It's Sloppy Joe Day!"
This time on Tasting History. A few months ago, I made the rectangular pizza that they used to serve in school cafeterias for decades. And in that video, I mentioned that I got the recipe from the 1988 book Quantity Recipes for School Food Service, put out by the US Department of Agriculture. Well, I have rarely had such an enthusiastic response to a video, and I had literally thousands of people messaging me asking me to make other dishes from their own youthful school days. So I looked through the book, and it has many things that I remember from growing up in school, but I think the most quintessential is the Sloppy Joe. This is, after all, the star of Adam Sandler's 1994 song from Saturday Night Live called Lunch Ladyland, which featured Chris Farley as the lunch lady and Kevin Nealon as Sloppy Joe. Now, looking at the cookbook, most of the recipes are to feed 100 hungry children, and I think 100 Sloppy Joes at my age is just asking for a heart attack, so I am cutting this down to 10 Sloppy Joes. 8 would actually be better because hamburger buns come in packs of 8, but that math made some really weird quantities, so I'm doing 10. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 3/4 pound or 800 grams of ground beef. The book says no more than 24% fat, a heaping 1/4 cup of fresh diced onions, 3/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, 10 tablespoons or 160 grams of tomato paste, 10 tablespoons or 165 grams of ketchup, or catsup because they spell it catsup with a C, which always bugs me for some reason. 1 cup plus 2 tablespoons or 265 milliliters of water, 3 tablespoons plus 2 teaspoons of vinegar, and it actually doesn't say what kind of vinegar to use, but I asked a viewer who is a former lunch lady, and she said it was probably apple cider vinegar. Then 1½ teaspoons of dry mustard, 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper, 4 teaspoons of brown sugar, and 10 or 8 hamburger buns if you don't want to buy 2 packs. Now, I am very excited to try these Sloppy Joes, but I must admit they are not the healthiest food out there. In fact, looking through this cookbook, I realized most of the food that they were feeding us as kids was not very healthy. I remember I used to often have an entire lunch of just French fries and a Nutter Butter, which I could get away with when I was 12, not so much now that I am an adult. So I am trying to eat healthier these days, which is made easier with help from today's sponsor, Thrive Market. Thrive Market is an online grocery store that focuses in healthy and sustainable products. And it is a membership-based store online, but then many of the actual products are at a discount. They're less expensive than if you went and bought them in person. And one thing I love about Thrive Market is that you can sort your groceries by diet, whether you are vegan or gluten intolerant, low sodium, or like me, just trying to cut out some sugar. I, with my perpetual sweet tooth, have been trying to find some snacks that I can have during the day that are not just chock full of added sugar, especially high fructose corn syrup, and I have found many of those snacks on Thrive Market. My favorites are these mango and guava gummies that are just mango and guava. Those are the only ingredients, so all the sugar comes straight from the fruit, and orders over $49 ship for free, so it gets delivered to your doorstep. It's like having a bunch of health food stores all in one place. So to join Thrive Market today, then visit my link, thrivemarket.com/maxmiller, and you will get 30% off of your first order plus a free gift. That is thrivemarket.com/maxmiller. And now back to our Sloppy Joes. So the first thing to do is heat a pan over medium-high heat and then add in the ground beef. You want to start breaking it up, and the recipe simply says to brown the meat, which took me about 3 or 4 minutes. Once the meat is browned, drain off as much of the grease as you can. Then add the garlic powder and the onions and stir them in and continue to cook for another 5 minutes. And the recipe actually gives the option for dried onions, but I remember fresh onions being in it when I was a kid, so that's what I opted for. Plus, I love that it gives a note that you want mature onions. Produce after dark. After 5 minutes of cooking, add in the tomato paste, the ketchup, the water, and the vinegar, and stir it all into the meat and onions. Then add the dry mustard, the pepper, and brown sugar, and make sure everything is well mixed, and then reduce the heat to medium-low and let it simmer for 25 to 30 minutes. This was by far my favorite part of the process because 1, it smelled so good, and 2, I love the sound. A simmering pan of Sloppy Joe sounds just divine. I could probably start an entire channel of just ASMR cooking sounds, and this would be an entire video, I think. Just gurgling Sloppy Joe. Anyway, this recipe was, as I mentioned, for 100 students, which sounds like a lot, but it pales in comparison with another recipe that was put out for 6,000. This was part of an ad campaign in 1978 to promote McCormick Schilling's Sloppy Joe Spice Blend, and it featured a fictional army cook offering up my Sloppy Joe's recipe for 6,000. Brown 1,000 pounds of ground meat, mix in 1,000 packages of McCormick Schilling Sloppy Joe mix, and blend thoroughly. Stir in 1,000 6-ounce cans of tomato paste and 1,250 cups of water. Bring to a boil. Then reduce heat and simmer 10 minutes, stirring occasionally. Spoon over hamburger buns, makes 6,000 half-cup servings. To get 6 servings, divide by 1,000. Now obviously that recipe is tongue-in-cheek, but it does seem makeable, except for the fact that simmering that much meat for 10 minutes ain't gonna do a thing, considering our much smaller amount needs to simmer for 25 to 30 minutes, which is more than enough time to talk to you about the dubious origins of the Sloppy Joe. Who invented the Sloppy Joe? Well, I have to say, I believe that is an unanswerable question, because first you would need to define what is a Sloppy Joe. When the Sloppy Joe was supposedly invented in the 1930s or early 40s, the term Sloppy Joe could refer to a bunch of things, both sandwich and non-sandwich related. But let me tell you at least a couple of the theories of where the Sloppy Joe originated. Theory number 1 begins in Iowa with the loose meat sandwich, a terrible name for a sandwich. This is essentially a sandwich made of ground beef, but instead of forming it into a patty like a hamburger, it is left loose, hence loose meat. I think it just doesn't sound good and appetizing as a sandwich. Supposedly, it happened that one day a cook named Joe in either Sioux City, Iowa or Muscatine, Iowa was making one of these loose meat sandwiches and decided to add some tomato sauce, thus creating the Sloppy Joe, named after him because his name was Joe. So what of this story is verifiable and what is not verifiable? Well, first off, it was almost definitely not named after a guy named Joe. That's just not likely. But other aspects of the origin story are plausible. Things like the fact that it possibly came from Iowa and that it is a possible descendant of the loose meat sandwich. In fact, today there are places that call Sloppy Joes wet loose meat sandwiches, which is even worse. So in 1926, a man named Fred Angel, sometimes spelled with one L, sometimes two, opened a restaurant called Made Right Sandwiches in Muscatine, Iowa. Well, by 1930, he had several shops, as well as several franchises, and had changed the name to Made Right Hamburg Shop, which claimed to be the home of the Hamburg sandwich. Now, exactly what that sandwich was is in question. The only contemporary description that I could find came from a newspaper in 1931 that simply said that Made Right hamburgers used choice beef, and once prepared, the meat is placed between a bun baked according to a special recipe. This bun is nearly 6 inches in diameter. In its entirety, the Made Right hamburger is a delicacy to tempt the worst dyspeptic. So it's just not clear exactly what this sandwich was like. Later on, it definitely became known as a loose meat sandwich and became the loose meat sandwich. But was it that in the 1930s? I'm not sure, but let's just say that it was. Did someone working at one of these Made Right shops put tomato sauce in there to make the first Sloppy Joe? Maybe, but they never told that story, and they never promoted anything like that until many, many years later, and even then, it wasn't under the name Sloppy Joe, so who knows? The thing is, there was a hamburger shop that did sell something called a Sloppy Joe. In 1944, in Coshocton, Ohio, 2 ads announced that Hap is introducing that new sandwich at the Hamburg shop, Sloppy Joe's, 10 cents. Though it doesn't actually claim to have invented the sandwich, rather, it says that it originated in Cuba. Cuba? Well, that's a long way from Ohio or Iowa. And that brings us to theory number 2. Havana, Cuba was the playground for many Americans during Prohibition. If you were on the West Coast, you went to Tijuana to drink, but if you were on the East Coast, it was Havana, Cuba. And in 1928, American newspapers claimed that the best-known person in America is Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh, but the best-known person in Cuba is Sloppy Joe. His real name was Jose Abel, and he had emigrated to Cuba from Spain in 1904, and by the 1920s, he had a place called Sloppy Joe's, which was the place for Americans to drink when they went to Havana. And in the 1920s and 30s, they had an assortment of cocktails, but eventually the sandwiches became more popular. Sloppy Joe's place is a big bar on a corner, and frankly, the best thing about it is the sandwiches they make. The bartenders are not front rank even by Havana standards. But just like the sandwich from Iowa, it's hard to say exactly what the sandwich was like in the 1930s. But they were definitely popular, as was the bar itself. It was mentioned in many, many newspapers around America, people going to Havana, Cuba, and one person that really loved it was author Ernest Hemingway. He was said to have encouraged his friend Joe Russell to rename his bar in Key West Sloppy Joe's, though some sources say the name change had nothing to do with the Havana bar, but rather because Joe's place was sloppy. They had a seafood bar set up where the melting ice just kind of made a slop on the floor. Regardless, they do now claim to serve the original Sloppy Joe sandwich, though since that claim didn't start until decades later, it's again impossible to say definitively if either the Cuban or the Key West bar actually invented the Sloppy Joe as we know it. And that is really the crux of the issue here, because what is the Sloppy Joe as we know it? Because in the 1930s and 40s, there were lots of sandwiches called Sloppy Joes that are nothing like the Sloppy Joe that we know. It just referred to any big sandwich with a lot of meat piled on it. One 1930s ad declares a hit for your party, the celebrated Sloppy Joe sandwich, a triple-decker sandwich of a whole loaf of Munchner rye sliced lengthwise and filled with ham, Swiss cheese, coleslaw, tongue, and Russian dressing. Serves for $1.25. It'd be like a $30 or $40 sandwich today, I swear. Another Sloppy Joe mentioned around this time came from Alabama, and it was said to have been named after a guy named Joe who invented the sandwich and then went off to fight in World War II, and that one was just ham and cheese. There was another from Kenosha, Wisconsin, which was roast beef and cheese, and that was sold at Sloppy Joe's Tavern. There were lots of sandwiches and restaurants called Sloppy Joe's all over the US, and Havana, I guess, at this time, so it's really hard to say who invented it, what the Sloppy Joe exactly was at that period, and so it's kind of a mystery. Especially because Sloppy Joe didn't even just refer to sandwiches. It referred to a bunch of different things back then. There were cartoon characters named Sloppy Joe. People referred to their messy friends as Sloppy Joes. There was even an entire style of clothing called Sloppy Joe, and it was worn by women in the 1940s because all the guys went off to fight in World War II, and so women had to enter the workforce, and they realized that pants and loose-fitting clothes made life a lot easier. It also ended up becoming a popular style of dress for teenagers, but some people did not like this. In 1943, the Grand Rapids Press ran an article about how young women were dressing. There are the inevitable Sloppy Joe sweaters, dropping untidily around the figure, the unattractive, shapeless pleated skirts, usually uneven at the hemline, and the dirty saddle Oxfords they all wear. Now, you might be forgiven if you think that this is some old fuddy-duddy talking about women's clothes at the time, but no, it was actually a 17-year-old Gloria Jean who was a child and then teenage actress, and quite a judgy one at that. The style seems to have remained popular into the 1950s, but by 1954, it had started to die out. An article by a Mrs. Walter Ferguson was titled, "A Woman's View, Out with Sloppy Joe." News from all over says our schoolgirls are getting neater and sweeter. The Sloppy Joe fashion is out. The shirt tail and dirty sandal shoes are replaced by well-fitting skirts, sweaters, and blouses. I imagine the change in fashion will also bring about some changes in behavior. It's easier to act like a lady if one is dressed like a lady. And with the end of Sloppy Joe fashion, the term Sloppy Joe does seem to have only been used for sandwiches, specifically the type of sandwich that we think of today. By the 1950s, it was very, very popular, especially among the younger crowd. When the teenage gang descends on your home for eats, let it be Sloppy Joes, and plenty of them. And since it was the youth that enjoyed the Sloppy Joe, it's no wonder that it quickly became a staple of cafeteria food at schools. In 1957, a Canadian columnist came down to visit some high schools in the United States. She wrote that 2 high schools that I know about, West Palm Beach, Florida, and Buffalo, New York, serve Sloppy Joes regularly in their cafeterias. To see those American teenagers load their trays with Sloppy Joes and milk and banana cream pie was an experience full of chuckles and pleasure. That was Mary Moore, and she ended up publishing multiple recipes for Sloppy Joe sandwiches, all being ground beef with some form of tomato sauce, and they soon became popular with her Canadian audience. She spent the next decade sharing different recipes for Sloppy Joes with her audience, often with an idea of making them a little less sloppy. In 1962, she had a recipe for not-so-sloppy Joes that substitute a can of undiluted vegetable soup for some of the tomatoey ingredients in Sloppy Joes, and this makes it pretty. She also suggests that you eat it not with your hands, but with a fork and knife like civilized people should. Then in 1966, she really hit her peak in getting rid of the sloppy from Sloppy Joes in what she called Sloppy Joes Glamorized. In an article titled Silver Platter for Sloppy Joes, "Because I am commanded constantly by you to keep the Hamburg recipes coming, I gave Sloppy Joes some careful consideration because they are so popular with the sloppy jeans crowd. I have come up with a treatment of them tidied up for an economical guest dinner. Served in grand style on your best silver platter, your guests will forget they are eating Hamburg." A more complex and formal Sloppy Joe, a Sloppy Joseph, if you will. On the other end of the spectrum, you had the quest to make Sloppy Joes more casual and easier. Enter the Manwich.
What's a manwich?
In 1969, Hunt's created a canned sauce which included everything you need for a Sloppy Joe except for the meat and the bun. It took the cook time down to just a few minutes, long enough to brown the meat and heat the sauce. And they became very popular with their slogan,
A sandwich is a sandwich, but a manwich is a meal.
Sloppy Joes were now officially part of our culture, a staple of American cuisine. Even James Beard, the award-winning chef, had to, rather begrudgingly, affirm that Sloppy Joe is a product of the modern age, and though it is not a palate-tingling delight, it has a large following. As a kid who grew up in the 80s and 90s, Sloppy Joes were a big part of my diet, especially when I was at school. But also Sloppy Joes were like in the zeitgeist then. Mainly because of Adam Sandler, I feel. First, he had his song, Lunch Lady Land, on SNL, and then in 1995, he released Billy Madison, where the lunch lady made him extra sloppy because
I know how you kids like 'em sloppy.
And with that, it is time for me to try my own extra Sloppy Joes. So once the meat has simmered for a half an hour and most of the liquid has steamed off, they are ready to serve. The original recipe says to portion with number 12 scoop, 1/3 cup, onto bottom half of each roll. Cover with top half of roll. And here we are, Sloppy Joes from the school cafeteria cookbook of my childhood. I cannot describe just how good this smells. I wish I had the words. What I love is, I know you can't smell sweet, but it smells sweet. I think it's just like the ketchup. But then there is also that tang, that zing of the little bit of vinegar in there. Smells so good. Here we go. That is so good. I should have made 100, y'all. I could eat 100 of these. Not in one sitting. That's so good. Oh man. It tastes exactly like I remember it. It is the middle school version. And you want to get the cheapest possible hamburger buns that you can. Make them yourself, but don't get a fancy bun. You want the really cheap, like Wonder Bread style hamburger bun for this. It's so good. You gotta make it. It's so easy. If you remember these from your childhood, I think outside of America, I don't think they really have these. Maybe I'm wrong. But if you're American or Canadian and you grew up with these, you gotta try this because it's just so nostalgic and really, really good. So I am actually going to finish this and a couple more because this is now my lunch because this is so good. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. Sloppy Joe, Sloppy Joe, yeah. Sloppy Joe, Sloppy Joe. Sloppy Joe, Sloppy Joe.